Welcome to Reflecting Light. This podcast is about filling the world with light by exploring myth, ancient texts, scripture, great works of world literature, and the works of artists, past and present, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. And now, here is your host, Mandy Green.
Hello and welcome to Reflecting Light. I'm your host, Mandy Green. Last week, I ended up taking the week off. I just could not find it in me to record. And so I actually wanted to talk about what that entailed, what caused it, and talk about the importance of us feeling all of our feelings fully. So I think it's very easy in today's world to get grief overload. We are so inundated with all of the things that are hard or going wrong or the true evils at work in the world and true genuine sorrows, true hardships. And sometimes it gets so much that we really can't process it. And we kind of go into grief overload. For me, it consisted of shutting down and in a very real way, this idea of self-preservation to just kind of block it out or just have to be away from it because it's so intense. And I think this is something that we've inherited from our culture and from the way things are done because we don't allow ourselves to feel things fully. Now, let me qualify this. It's this idea that unless you're happy, unless you're joyful, unless everything's going well, that you can't grieve, you can't express a negative emotion. So as we feel different things, they say to feel them without judgment. We're learning how to do that in our family. We're learning to look at a feeling and process it without judging it as good or bad. But what's happened in our culture at large is we've looked at and grouped two different sets of feelings. One is acceptable and one is unacceptable. And these unacceptable ones tend to be on the darker side of the spectrum, or we assign them to the darker side of the spectrum. Sadness, depression, fear, grief, anger, rage, frustration, exhaustion. And when we feel them, I'm not sure we allow ourselves to feel them because our self-preservation or our conditioning or our culture or all of the above play into that decision to say, well, we shouldn't go there. We shouldn't go there. We shouldn't feel that. Everything's fine. Everything's going to be okay. But what happens is the more we repress the hard stuff, the more we shove it down there, it's just going to continue to act on us, but not in a way that we're conscious and deliberate about. And that usually will cause this huge buildup. And then we really have some really intense feelings to work through and sort through. That's really kind of what happened. And so I'm reading this book called The Tao of Fully Feeling. I wanted to share some thoughts from the author, Pete Walker. And then I wanted to show you how this shows up in the ministry of Jesus Christ. Christ was perfect, meaning in Greek, teleos, complete, whole, fully developed. But in doing so, we tend to somehow think that he never was grieving, he never was angry, he never was frustrated, he never was exhausted. And in that sense, we don't really think about the Lord in those settings. So I want to look at how we can allow ourselves or just open up our awareness to feeling all the things. Now, this doesn't mean that you wallow in them. It doesn't mean you live in this space. But all of the great Eastern thinkers tend to say you need to let yourself feel your feelings. And it's like in the movie Up, right? You're watching the thoughts go by like cars, blue car, red car, grief, rage, excitement, happiness, love, pain, and watch it and feel it, but then let it go. Don't let it get stuck behind this dam of what should be. So let me share with you some observations by this particular author. And then I want to look at how this shows up in the New Testament. We suffer many dire consequences when we are unwilling to feel. The price of emotional repression is a constant, wasteful expenditure of energy that leaves many of us depressed and taciturn. Perpetually enervated, more and more of us sink into the apathy and the ennui of the seen that, been there, done that syndrome. When this occurs, we forfeit our destiny of growing into the vitally expressive and life celebratory beings we were born to be. Our war on feelings forces our emotions to turn against us. Much of our unnecessary suffering is caused by the ghosts of our murdered emotions wafting into consciousness and haunting us with hurtful thinking. Denied emotions taint our thoughts with fearful worry, dour self-doubt, and angry self-criticism. The epidemics of overeating, overmedicating, and overworking that plague America are also rooted in our mass retreat from feeling. We are feeling phobic. We are compelled to distract ourselves from our emotions with mood-altering substances, workaholism, or constant busyness. Ironically, our distractions typically add to the underlying pain we are trying to avoid. With chronic use, they eventually do great damage to our bodies. Continues on that grieving is a safe, healthy release valve for our internal pressure cookers of emotions. And then concludes by saying, those who dare to express feelings that are anything but positive are increasingly seen as pitiful and unevolved for not choosing more exalted states. What a terrible abandonment of the natural human inclination, still extant in non-industrialized pockets of the world, to offer compassion to an anguished friend. A shoulder to cry on and permission to have a good bitch and moan are disappearing sacraments in industrialized societies. In our culture, empathy at its best is advising our aggrieved friends to look on the bright side and remember it could be worse. The negative emotions add dark colors to an artist's palette. They open up an infinite range of color, hue, and tone. Without black on the palette, there are no rich colors, no depths, no contrasts, no intricacies. Without the dark colors, it is impossible to capture the infinitely diverse themes and landscapes of life. So in that regard, I wanted to look at some of these emotions that we consider negative or dark or shadowed, whatever word you choose to say, and look at how they show up in the Savior's life in the New Testament. So let's look at this idea of exhaustion and isolation, sorrow, grief. Psalm of Isaiah 53 says, "Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows." He is acquainted with grief. It's one of the first things that's labeled about the Lord is that he knows our griefs. He carries them literally. He lifts them on his back. He raises them up. So that's one example. Another example is when Herod Antipas beheaded John the Baptist. When Jesus heard about it in Matthew 14, it says, when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. That's really instructive to us that he gave himself time to grieve. He gave himself the space to grieve. We experience 1,000 different losses in the course of our lifetimes. losses of what might have been, what would have looked like, children who didn't meet our expectations, marriages, family, situations, and a real healthy person emotionally is able to grieve each of those losses, to acknowledge them. And here we have the Savior showing that acknowledgement. And right after it said, the crowds found out about it and followed him on foot from the towns. When he stepped ashore and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, this word compassion comes from the Latin root, which literally means to suffer. Pati means to suffer, and the prefix com means with. So it literally means to suffer with. That grief, that sorrow actually was a way for him to suffer with those who were experiencing illness. And there's a variety of illness that happens. And I would put that up for your own examination. Can your exhaustion, your grief, your suffering teach you how to better suffer with others? We have a very fix-it mentality. Particularly as parents, I know my desire is always to fix it, to just jump in and fix it. Well, looking at the Lord's example, it would seem that the more powerful way to approach this would to be to simply suffer with, to sit beside someone, to let their tears hit your shoulder, to hold a hand, to listen, to just be with. Luke 5:6 says, yet frequently he withdrew to the wilderness to pray. He frequently would have to take this time to process, to think, to grieve, to recover perhaps from the weight of his mission. In John 6:5 says, Jesus, realizing they were about to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Clearly, solitary time, figuring things out, spending time. These are things that the Lord practiced and felt that grief and that isolation. Now, personally, when I reflect on the Lord's life, my favorite question to ask, and maybe you could answer this, email me your answer. I would love to know all of the answers to this. We could have a podcast about this even. But I love to ask people, if you could look at one moment from the Lord's mortal life, what would it be? And mine's changed over the years, but right now, it's this rage that he expresses. So let's look at John chapter 2, where he really just gives a tongue lashing to these scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. Now, what's so interesting about this that I just learned from Jared Halverson's podcast was that a scribal tradition is based solely on scripture. So one thing that makes the Sermon on the Mount so wildly extraordinary is that Christ is quoting from the scribal tradition. He's saying, you've seen it written, but then he rewrites it. And the inference is that he is the writer of the law. And I would love to just see him when he mic drops. That's my moment. They portrayed it in The Chosen in one of the last few episodes where he just looks at them and he says, I am the law, and walks out. And I was like, yes. This anger, this righteous rage is what I like to call it, absolutely comes up in his ministry. He absolutely voices his righteous rage and his disgust at those who would use the law and the commandments to beat other people and to hurt other people, to use it as a weapon of oppression rather than a vehicle for enlightenment. So let's read some words here. I mean, I would love to see this. Verse 13 of John chapter 2. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in other men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let in those who wish to enter. I think this really, of anything, is really the Lord's main point, that those who would oppress and deprive others of spiritual insight, illumination, blessings, when they themselves won't go in, but those who wish to receive it, they would deprive of. They would even set up barriers to them gaining this spiritual light and knowledge. And that seems to be, of all of the people he interacts with in the New Testament, I don't know that any get his ire like this particular group. Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You traverse land and sea to win a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Now, I don't know about you, but calling someone a son of hell is pretty big. It's pretty big. Woe to you, blind guides! You are like whitewashed tombs. Now, that's particularly offensive because anything to do with a tomb or a grave or death is ritually unclean. And he just calls it out, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and every kind of impurity. In the same way, on the outside you appear to be righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. He continues to say, ye snakes, ye brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Well, I don't know about you, but that would be amazingly rad to watch. I would love to see it. There are things that deserve our righteous rage. There are things that go on that should not go on. And it seems of all the things in the Lord's life, this is the thing he takes biggest issue with. All right, sorrow. Well, for this, let's go to John 11. This is the story of Lazarus. He knows Lazarus has died. He knows he's going to raise him. But he doesn't stop himself from feeling everything that goes with it. He doesn't stop himself with suffering with Mary and Martha and with those who loved Lazarus. He doesn't cap his own love for Lazarus. He allows himself to feel it fully and to grieve. This is very, very instructive. John 11:20. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. I love this about Martha. I love that she races to meet the Lord. I love that she races to have a conversation with him, to understand. Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. I think all of us have this graveyard of buried hopes, don't we? If you were here, this wouldn't happen. If you were here, this person would not have done this. If you were here, my marriage would have worked. If you were here, this child would not have left. If you were here, this person wouldn't have died. In verse 23, Jesus says, your brother will rise again. Jesus told her. Martha replied, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am. Anytime you see that I am, he's referencing himself as the God of the Old Testament, the one who causes to be. That should be in caps. Anytime you read that, I want you to circle it in your New Testament. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though he dies. Inferred in this is this idea that we will die. And maybe we'll die 1,000 times in 1,000 ways to the things that we love and cherish and honor. I don't see anything here that says we will escape those 1,000 deaths of who we used to be, who we want to be, time lost, things lost, people lost. The promise is that we will live even though we die. Verse 26, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she answered. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. After Martha had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside to tell her, the teacher is here and is asking for you. I love that he takes a private moment with Martha and instructs Martha in the way that she feels and she understands and has compassion on her. And then you'll see that as he has compassion on Mary, that it's different. And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were in the house consoling Mary saw how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary came to Jesus and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, agitated, stirred up, anxious. Where have you put him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they answered. In verse 35, Jesus wept. Knowing all he did, he still felt fully what that must have felt like. Verse 36, the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept Lazarus from dying? I think we all ask this question 1,000 times in 1,000 ways. And look at how the Lord responds. Jesus once again being deeply moved, weeping, feeling it, expressing it fully. He knew what was going to happen. Isn't it so beautiful and instructive that he didn't say, there, it's all going to be okay. I'm going to fix it. He didn't, because he knew they had to experience that fully in order to know the joy that awaited on the other side. And he goes to the tomb. He goes to the place where the things we love are buried. And he will give them new life. But to avoid grief, to avoid death is not what this scriptural account would teach us. Lastly, I wanted to talk about frustration. Luke 11, as the Lord is teaching and trying to get his disciples to help him with the work, and they aren't able to heal people and cast out devils. And he expresses this frustration with them. And he expresses his frustration with the crowds, all these people who want something from him, but are unwilling to give something to get that from him. Luke 11:29 says, as the crowds were increasing, Jesus said, this is a wicked generation. It demands a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. The queen of the south will rise at the judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And now one greater than Solomon is here. Now, I particularly love this because I love the Queen of Sheba. Talked a little bit about her. But it's so easy to look at her. I know a lot of people look at her and say, I don't know, right? Particularly maybe what I commented about her a few episodes ago. But here he is giving her credence and saying she recognized the wisdom of Solomon, and now one greater than Solomon's here, and yet you won't come. You won't look at it. You demand a sign. And at the end of the chapter, it says, as Jesus went from there, the scribes and Pharisees began to oppose him bitterly and to ply him with questions about many things, waiting to catch him in something he might say. Well, he gets frustrated with our humanity and our unwillingness to see and our unwillingness to look to what is already there. What is there that you can already learn and glean from? And how can these experiences carve out more space for the light to come in? Nobody knows the polarity of light and dark greater than those heavenly beings who have experienced both. Surely Gethsemane would teach us that there is no joy and exaltation without traveling that dark, lonely place. And the last thing I wanted to reference is a bit about compassion here, found in Matthew 9, verse 29. As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. And there were 2 blind men sitting beside the road. Anytime you read about a blind man, I want you to put yourself in the place of that blind man, because we are all operating with tremendous blindness here. And this is the do or die. This is how you can distinguish yourself from a faithful to a faithless follower. When they heard that Jesus was passing out, they cried out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Now, I love this because they're bucking the system. They're crying out because in the next verse, the crowd admonished them to be silent. You look stupid. You look idiotic. Stop yelling at him. Stop harassing him. You'll notice the woman with the issue of blood, even his own disciples they were packed in and people were trying to access the Lord. She really wasn't given access. She had to find a way to get her own access. And it's so beautiful to me that he allowed her that access. And so here they are crying out, no matter what the social repercussions are. They cried out all the louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped and called to them. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. This is so us. We cry out, we ask for help, but we need to know what we would like the Lord do. We need to have a solution or a petition. Lord, they answered, "Let our eyes be opened." Moved with compassion. And again, this tremendous ability he has to suffer with that literally moves him to act on their behalf. Jesus touched their eyes, and at once, and this is like immediately, they received their sight and followed him. Well, none of these are great things. Being blind, not a great thing. But in being blind, I would love to hear the rest of this story. I would love to hear what it was like to see color, to see people, to see the beauty of Galilee where they were, to see nature, to see people smile, to see people cry, to see the Lord look at and interact with people. That's the rest of the story. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I guess my point is that in being blind, they understood who they needed help from. They understood who they needed to turn to. And they went about it. They got there on the Y side. They were crying out. They were getting his attention. And then had something that they wanted him to do for them. And they followed him after that experience. And perhaps all of the things in our lives, as Rainer Maria Rilke says, are all dragons waiting to see us once beautiful and brave. Maybe everything in its deepest sense is something helpless that wants help from us. So you must not be saddened if a darkness rises up larger than you have ever known, if a restiveness like light and cloud shadows passes over your hands and all that you do, you must think that something is happening to you. that life has not forgotten you, that it holds you in its hand. It will not let you fall. If you need one of the best books ever written to read that talks so much about the beauty of our experience, I highly, highly recommend Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. This particular quote, I'll put it in the show notes, is called, "How should we ever forget those ancient myths that are at the beginning of all peoples? The myths about the dragons who at the last second turn into princesses." There is a purpose to this. If you're ever around a child, they feel it all, don't they? And then they quickly move forward. My friends, the dark provides the contrast for the light. The dark will carve out the canyons of our soul that open us up to the joy of the living good news of heaven. And it's my desire that I look at this more fully in my own life, that I feel what's there, that I let it ride, that I acknowledge it. Now, this doesn't mean taking it and getting stuck in it, but I think the more we're able to feel, the more we are able to become more godlike. And that suffering allows us to have compassion or to be able to suffer with someone else. Thomas Aquinas, a Christian theologian, said that no one becomes compassionate unless he suffers. Perhaps this is all a way to bring us to each other. The Bible is rife with family problems, interpersonal problems, issues. And as much as I would like to disengage from life and certain people and situations that are taxing, that really is part of how we learn. Our ability to feel will make us more Christ-like. Well, that is the podcast for today. Maybe today, I always say I wish you love and light, but maybe I wish you an equal helping of love, of light and dark, and love and apathy. They say that the opposite of love isn't hate, because hate is this passionate emotion. Not that I'm always experiencing passionate emotions. Yes, I am. But love and the absence of love. Maybe this week can be a week of contrast for all of us, and we can use that to look at our palette, to look at what heaven is teaching us about color and hue and design, so that we can have a greater understanding of light and dark and love and light.
Thank you for joining us for Reflecting Light with Mandy Green. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a good rating and share it with your friends. And remember, your light makes the world a brighter place. Share it.